Well, it's good to see that you all made it back from lunch. We're going to be starting with our afternoon keynote session and then going into another panel discussion. So our keynote speaker this afternoon is MacKenzie Smith from the University of California, Davis, and she'll be talking about the Pay It Forward project that University of California has been working on.
While Layla gets the slides up, I just want to thank everybody for coming back from lunch and let you know that this is my least favorite spot to have, the keynote right after lunch when you're all fully fed and ready for a nap. And here I have a data-intensive talk, so I apologize in advance. I realize these slides are really hard to see from most of the room because I've been sitting in various areas, so they're posting them. It's all in the report. Don't worry too much about the slides, and then hopefully I'll convey the important parts in them. And as you heard, what I'm going to be talking about today is this project, Pay It Forward, that I'm sure many of you have heard about at some point over the past couple of years. So I'll walk you through the project pretty quickly and then talk about some of the lessons learned along the way and things that we are taking away from the project. And I hope we'll have plenty of time for a lively discussion after that, because I should also say that we did not start out to advocate for APCs as the solution for open access. We really had a very specific goal in mind, but of course, in the process of doing this, we did form some opinions about how well this would work. So let me launch in. First of all, what motivated the project several years ago was this observation that policy in the US and Canada was taking a very different direction than Europe and the UK, and some of us kind of operate in both worlds, and what we're concerned that we were kind of on a collision course and we needed to understand whether the European model in particular could work here in the US, where we have an incredibly different sort of funding and shared governance model than you often see in the UK and Europe. And like I said, we were not going into it assuming that APCs were good or bad as a way of achieving 100% open access, but just that we really wanted to understand more about that. And so we took on this project, which was investigating a sustainable model of open access article processing charges for large North American research institutions. So the scope was very tight. It was the biggest institutions that are the most research intensive in the US, since the University of California, for example, is responsible for at least 2% of the world's peer-reviewed scholarly research articles. So what works for these big institutions will have a huge impact on whether this can ultimately succeed as a new model. And so to do that, we built a set of financial scenarios or models that looked at the financial implications of this APC system if it were at scale, 100% converted to this model, okay? And we all know that's probably not the way it will play out, but the OA 2020 proposal was a very provocative proposal that we should aim for that goal, a 100% conversion to this model. So what would that actually look like? So we partnered with some other major North American research universities. So you can see the list there: Harvard, Ohio State, University of British Columbia, and all 10 campuses of the University of California. We limited our study to journals and conference proceedings. We did not look at books or other kinds of newer forms of publication. And as I said, we were focused on the 100% question. So we started with a lot of quantitative research. The list is there, and I want to acknowledge David Solomon sitting here, who was a major participant in this project with Bo Christer Bjork in looking at this data, so he can also answer questions about that. And we collected a lot of stuff. We looked at what libraries are actually spending on journals for a 5-year period, 2009 to 13. We looked at all the publication data for those same years by authors at those same institutions, so who was really publishing what where. We looked at as much research funding data as we could get our hands on from the NSF HERD survey. There was nothing like that in Canada. This is really hard data to get your hands on. So finding out exactly how much grant funding is available for this kind of stuff is not something that is obvious how to do. We looked at APCs from multiple sources. That's a lot of the work that David was doing for the project and has done in many other cases as well. And we looked at publication cost data. What does it cost to publish? So I'll give you some of the results for that stuff. What does it cost to publish an article? Well, so, we looked at 1099s and we talked to publishers and got the data from a lot of different ways and came up with this wide range of article cost from $500 to $4,000. And the plausible minimum that we came up with is about just over $1,000 per article, including a small 13% surplus. So this was an argument that we had many times with people from Elsevier and other companies, that you can't just look at the cost because businesses have to stay in business, so you have to build a surplus in, and we tried to accommodate that view. So the minimum CPA we come up with was about $1,000, and the defensible cost per article, based on the publications that our authors actually publish in, so excluding a lot of journals that they would never go to, it was $1,864 per article, okay? However, as we thought about this more, we realized that this is kind of a stupid question. What does it cost to publish an article? Because there's so much variation. It depends on what you include in that cost structure. It depends on publication volume, which, as we all know, is going up. And most importantly, it includes the publisher's fixed effects, their fixed costs, which can vary wildly depending on whether you're in Sonoma or London. So it's not that useful to look at the cost unless we can all agree on some kind of normalization of those variables. So in the end, we decided not to pay too much attention to that, and we turned to article processing charges. So for fully open access journals, as I'm sure most of you already know, these are the journals in which our authors actually publish, right? So we're eliminating the ones that they wouldn't go to, $1,775. For converted journals, so hybrid in particular, $1,825, right? So these all sound like the same kind of ballpark that we've been hearing about for a while, nothing new there. And again, we concluded that actually looking at current APCs wasn't that very useful for our purposes because we're interested in the 100% question, right? And the vast majority of journals aren't open access. They may not even offer an open access option. So really, you have to be imagining, well, what's going to happen in the future when all of those journals have also gone away with an APC-based funding model? And also, we don't tend to talk about this a lot, but there's just not a lot of representation in the humanities and social sciences in this data because there are so few journals in those disciplines that are open access or are even experimenting with it. So we're missing large parts of the literature if we just look at what's happening right now. Then we did this interesting calculation. Okay, let's assume for a moment that the source of the APCs is my budget, the library's journal expenditure budget. What could I afford? So we just did some basic math. We took a journal budget, and this is a sample year, 2013. That year I spent about $4 million on journal subscriptions, just one university. We published that year just about 3,600 journal articles. 2,500 were associated with grants. The rest of them were not. So if you do the math, if it's just my budget, I could afford to pay up to $1,119 per article. If you assume that the grants will cover the ones that they can cover, that assumes that the author can use their grant to pay the APC. What I could afford then is $3,651 per article. So you see the spread there. If it's just my budget, we're not even close. If it's the grants paying first and then my budget, we're in good shape. And we saw this play out again and again. So, for example, if you looked at all the partners, the more research intensive you are, the closer you are to the bottom of this scale. You're in the red, right? And the less research intensive you are, so colleges that don't have a lot of research programs, just less research intensive universities, more teaching focused ones are up in the green area. And then again, if you look at it by without grants, we're well below the cost that we need to be able to cover, which is the double bar there. If you look at it with grants, there were only 2 exceptions to the answer that we would be in good shape if grants paid first and the library only had to subsidize what was remaining. But again, like I said, the current APCs aren't really necessarily that relevant, because what's really going to matter is what APCs will be in the future when everybody has converted to this model. And there were 2 distinctive types of publishers, those for whom there is no correlation between quality and cost. And a lot of the OA publishers here today are in that category because they have funding from some other source, a foundation or a library consortium or something, so they don't need to think about that. They don't need to charge anything necessarily. But we found that with more traditional kinds of journals, there is a strong positive correlation between the quality and the price that's charged. And our research proved this, but I know there's been other articles. I know David and Bo Krister published one just a year or 2 ago that also found a very strong correlation. We looked at the SNP, source normalized impact per paper, rather than impact factor, because it's a little bit more discipline nuanced. And I'm not endorsing IFs or SNPs at all. We're just saying that for the purposes of this project, we can use that as a proxy for perceived quality. So we came up with a formula. We did a regression analysis of APCs and said, okay, you're a publisher who has no journals that are OA now. What are you going to set your APCs at? You're going to look at your SNP value, and this is the formula. It's $1,147 plus another $709 per SNP above 1, 1 being the absolute kind of average, okay? So that allows you to assign an APC to every single article that was published during our sample period, right? So you can look at all, there were tens of thousands of articles from that 5-year period. And we were able to assign an APC to every single one of those based on this assumption of predicting what that APC is going to be. And by the way, using this formula, the baseline cost is that would be amazing, $1,856, which is ironically, just about exactly what they are now. So go figure. Okay, so then we start looking at, okay, now what's going to happen if you take my budget and you estimate what the APCs would have been in that same sample year. And it turns out that that would have cost me $7.49 million that year, as opposed to the $4 million that I actually did spend, okay? And that, so that's slightly higher than average. What we found is that for every library we looked at, it was probably around 1.5 times more than today, if it's only the library budget. And remember, we're talking about research-intensive universities, right? The more productive, high publication volumes. If you looked at papers without grants, the cost to me would have been $2.22 million, which is significantly less than my current journal budget. So again, it all boils down to how much of the grant income you can capture as part of this, okay? So, conclusions to this point. Future APCs are not perfectly predictable, nor are differences across disciplines for the APCs. But we can start to build what we'll call just crude estimations of what they will be and use those to improve them over time, right? So that's kind of our first hypothesis that we want to talk to you about is, is it useful to estimate APCs, and is this the right direction for doing that? Also, in North America at least, unlike some of the findings in other parts of the world, library journal budgets will not be sufficient to cover APCs if we're the only source of the money. Okay, that's just very clear. But that if we can capture the grant funds, we're fine. Okay? So, the question we had asked at the beginning is, will this be sustainable over time, this model? So I realize you can't read a single word of this, so I will read it to you. This is from Tim Gowers in an interview with Richard Poindar earlier this year, which came out roughly the time we were writing our final report and really struck me, because the first quote is, "Funding a journal with APCs is acceptable if authors do not have to pay the money themselves." Okay, that's Tim's first quote. Second, I think this, and by that he meant open access big deals where libraries are negotiating for lower APCs and, you know, it's just kind of a same players, different model. If he thinks that that is beginning to happen and that publishers are finding ways to create an APC-based market that will be as dysfunctional as the subscription market is now. Sorry, I can read it better from here. The basic problem with APCs is that publishers can charge what they like, knowing that if universities start to tell academics that they have to publish in cheaper journals, there will be an uproar and the perceived threat to academic freedom, which I can testify to. I have never seen a convincing explanation for how properly free market in APCs could work. Okay, and that was an important quote because I think that's sort of where we ended up in this project, was imagining how a free market could work and what impact it would have on our ecosystem. So I'm going to turn now to the qualitative research we did to show you some of the evidence we have for that last comment I made. We did a very big author study. I know there have been others, but we tried to really look at every career stage, every discipline, and capture a number of different attitudes that we think are relevant. So just to you know, satisfy the number wonks in the room, there were 77 faculty, postdocs, and graduate students in all disciplines for a focus group, which informed a survey that was completed by more than 2,000 faculty at the partner institutions, minus Harvard. And again, faculty, grad students, and postdocs. So we had very early career through very senior people. Okay, so a couple of facts that came out of that, or findings. If they had to rank what they care about when they're choosing where to publish an article, no surprise. You know, number one is the quality and reputation of the journal. Number 8, and last, was whether or not it's open access. Okay? So this is a quote from Carol Tennepier, taken together, it's evident that the reputation building within a specific field is at the heart of what matters most to academic scholars, okay? So I don't think anybody here would disagree with that finding. The other thing we found that was very interesting was that authors actually are price sensitive. So we asked them, you don't have to take pictures of these slides because they'll be online, but that's okay. All right, author willingness to pay. So we asked them, okay, you know, if you had to pay an APC, what would you find an acceptable APC if the money was coming from here versus here? And they had choices like, you know, your pocket versus a research fund that you've been given versus, you know, a grant. And across the board, they assigned a lower number the closer it was to them personally. You know, so they're willing to spend grant funds, they're willing to spend university funds, they're not willing to spend their own funds, and they're on the fence about these research funds, right? So again, that's kind of common sense if you believe in market economics, but there is author discretion and there is an incentive to economize. And I know that people need tenure and they have to publish in certain journals to achieve that, and we're not saying that they wouldn't do that, we're just saying that in general, they are sensitive to the cost and will be thinking carefully about the cost-benefit ratio if they're involved. So attitudes towards open access in general and APCs in particular were wildly all over the place. You know, there were no patterns for career stage, discipline, or anything. They're just like everybody has their own opinion about it. But all the authors exhibited price sensitivity if they have to choose where to publish based on the cost and quality. So we come back to this question about long-term sustainability. So we set a behavioral objective in economic terms. Authors will choose the best platform for their article given the price of access, publication funding, platform readership, and perceived quality, right? Second, publishers respond to elastic author demand by competing for submissions. And this is an important point because I've seen people say, notably David Schulenberger in an op-ed piece he wrote recently, that authors have no market power, whereas libraries and consortia of libraries have lots of market power, and I just completely disagree with that. You know, I think, I'm not an economist, but we are working with economists who say, well, actually it's the other way around. Publishers compete for authors. That's what they care about. You know, and the libraries are just purchasing agents to them. We do have some market clout, but if that were really true, we wouldn't be here today, right? If libraries had the kind of clout that he's asserting, we would have solved this problem long ago and journal subscriptions would be modest. So we're asserting that authors actually do have a lot of market power, although maybe not for a specific article on a specific day, right? If they've got that once-in-a-career Nature article in their hand, they're going to try to get it into Nature, even if Nature costs $30,000, right? But that's an exceptional situation, right? So our assertion is that authors will behave rationally most of the time. So, claim, under ideal conditions, competition in an OA environment will lower the cost of scholarly communication. Not all at once, but over time. 2, many mitigating factors such as platform ownership concentration, delegation of APC payments, etc. There are many mitigating factors about that claim that competition will emerge, such as whether libraries are doing the negotiating, using offsetting agreements and things like that. So finally, the implementation proposal is that we need to give authors more authority and so that they have more skin in the game. If they can pay APCs using money that they could use for other things, like going to conferences or paying for graduate students or the millions of things that researchers have to pay for, then suddenly they're going to have to get a lot more conscientious about how they're using that money if it also has to pay APCs. And that institutional subsidies will still be important to level the playing field so that we're not asking authors to find this money out of thin air. So what would this cost? Let me give you a couple of examples. So we called this the multi-payer scenario, mainly because the analogies to the healthcare system are so glaringly obvious. So in this particular example, and every university, every library can do this differently, we would the library would provide a subsidy up to the break-even cost, given my current journal budget. So we would give you $1,164 towards your APC. In that model, the library budget is the same as it was before, because we've engineered it that way. The grants that are available to authors would cover another $2.5 million of that total, assuming they can use their grant funds for this. So the delta, the money that we would have to provide to authors beyond those two sources, is about $1 million, okay, to cover all of the papers. So that's a $1 million increase to the institutional cost of scholarly communication in that year, okay? In a second example, we bumped the library subsidy up to cover a typical journal or an average journal, SNP equals 1. So that's $1,857. So now my budget has just gone up a couple $1 million a year from the institution. Grants are covering slightly less of that because I've paid more. So they're under $1 million. And then the discretionary funds are $0.3 million, right? So the total increase to the institution is higher, 2.7, because they're having to up my budget. But the cost to the amount that you have to give authors is almost invisible. So, we're asserting that if you give authors discretionary funds, okay, that will introduce price competition without interfering with choice in where to publish. And that will, over time, encourage a competitive journal market, which we don't have now, encourage authors to explore new options. And this is incredibly important for you in this room, because this will actually force them to think about whether there are actually better platforms out there where they'll get more bang for their buck. And they're not doing that now, not much from what we saw. So it will drive costs down over time. So, and just an anecdote about that, one of the humanists that were surveyed said, well, if I had to pay my own APCs for journal articles, I would start thinking really hard about alternative methods of publishing. Maybe I don't need to publish in journals anymore. And we're like, yes, why haven't you been saying that all along? Why does it matter if the funding is coming from me or you, for you to see that there might be better ways to publish today? But this really does sort of force the issue for a lot of people in new ways. There's something else I wanted to say about that. Oh, yes, lest you think this is crazy, this idea of giving research accounts to authors, we already do this. Those of you who are on universities know that many, many researchers have a research fund that they can use to pay incidental expenses. They vary a lot in how much is in them, but a lot of them get them as part of a startup package. And in fact, at Berkeley, who was one of the campuses we were working with, they've introduced this thing called a bear account, where every member of the academic senate there gets $2,000 a year to spend on research. And they can do whatever they want with it. And it's incredibly popular, and it hasn't cost the institution all that much money. So we don't think that it's out of the question that you could kind of shift who the money goes to a little bit and give more of it to authors in these discretionary accounts, and then they really could become somewhat more accountable for the decisions about where to publish. So I did want to acknowledge that we were only looking at big North American research universities that are relatively well-funded and whose researchers have access to grant funding, typically. So we acknowledge that what we're finding isn't necessarily going to play out the same way everywhere, right? There are disciplines that have no grant funding, and some of those people work for universities that can't afford to give them discretionary accounts or have very small library budgets. There are young and or independent scholars who don't have access to an institution to fund their work. And then, of course, there's the so-called Global South, institutions that don't have large research funding agencies. Although what we did find is that lower research intensive versus current library budget works pretty well. So what I would want to do is look at the library budgets and general research funding at these institutions and compare that to their publication volume to see if they really would be better or worse off. Other things we didn't look at are other kinds of stakeholder roles. So one of the things libraries do now is that we negotiate for kind of common good things like text mining rates, which we were talking about earlier before lunch. Long-term preservation, right? So I don't think authors would necessarily think of those things to negotiate for. So it would be good if the institution, particularly the library, is still involved in this transaction somehow so that we can ensure that somebody is worrying about reuse rights and long-term preservation and so on. And the other thing is that today we completely lack any compliance tracking mechanisms. I think in Europe they're pretty well established. You have the RAE, REF, and many other acronyms for how you track publication and other research outputs, and we have none of that here. None of it. So it would be really hard to make sure that people are doing what they're supposed to. The report is a 200-page doorstop, which you're all welcome to go and download from that URL. It has all of the data. We've posted the data online under CC0, so everybody is free to reproduce this or do whatever you want with that data. And just, in closing, we think that, I think you would all agree, that the current scholarly journal system we have is not working. From my perspective, I've been in this business for 30 years now, and the journal crisis is still with us from the economic point of view. As Heather said this morning, sitting in the library world, yes, we agree that open access is really about, the public good. It's a more sensible way to share research results, but we do still worry about money a lot. We all want open access, but it is time for a change, right? We have to get there somehow. And change is very hard in distributed systems where every part of the world behaves differently, and in some cases, every individual behaves differently. So this is kind of where we came out of the project with this conclusion that it is sustainable at scale under certain conditions, which are that grant funding is available to authors to help offset APC costs as much as possible, and that institutions will need to provide some sort of discretionary funding to authors to get them more engaged in the conversation and lower costs over time. And if that's not the right solution, I'm all ears. We're not wedded to this, but we haven't heard other solutions that solve this problem of the lack of market behavior. And I know there's going to be a great panel right after this talking about exactly that issue. So, I'm hoping that we can spend the next 15 minutes or so and then that session talking about which of these models we prefer, because we have to do something. And with that, I will stop talking and ask for questions. Thank you. Bring it on.
Okay. Thank you so much. My name is Christine Stamison. I'm the director of the Northeast Research Libraries Consortium.
Okay, I know it well.
Okay. I read your 200 pages when it came out. I was thrilled. Last year, just when we were starting to negotiate on a big deal publisher, I brought this up to my members, and my members are some of the largest intensive research organizations in the US. They really wanted nothing to do with the offsetting of the APC. They said it would be too difficult to handle in their libraries, and it's something else they didn't want. They're starting to rethink that now, I think, which I'm very happy about. But I'm glad you did the study. And also, text and data mining is very important. It's something that we're trying to get into all of our licenses. And for publishers sitting out there, my members told me that they would be willing to pay a little bit more for your journals if they could text and data mine that resource. So I think that's something good. And not to make the license very restrictive, because that's one of the things that we're looking at right now. I'm seeing all these text and data mining addendums come in, which are 3 pages, where it really doesn't need to be more than a couple of paragraphs. So anyways.
Thank you. Yes, those are good comments. And I did want to say that offsetting, that was the quote from Tim Gowers that I was mentioning, because it is an interesting transition strategy, and the University of California is exploring it too, but it doesn't get us out of this problem of who has market power, right? We're just it's renegotiating licenses in a different mode. Heather, and then
Katrina, sorry, I grabbed the microphone here. So if we're truly talking about an open access world, why are we negotiating licenses in text and data mining at all? There are inherent rights that we would have to those articles. Those are costs that go away. Those are roles we no longer have to spend money or time in the libraries spending time on. So I would really encourage people, especially in the library community, to stop thinking about text and data mining in an open access environment as an add-on. It's an inherent right in the open environment.
Heather, I completely agree with you, but I would make the point that the reason we still have to worry about it is because of copyright. Even if something's open access, somebody still has the copyright to it, right? And if that owner chooses the right license, then we're good, right? But there has to be a license because it's under copyright. So I don't quite know how to get out of that, but I agree that we want to get to a point where it is assumed that all those terms and conditions are going to be there. Completely, yeah. Yes?
Hello, my name is Christoph Bruch from Helmholtz. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Helmholtz Association. I also wanted to comment on this text and data mining issue. First of all, you didn't mention, and that's not meant to criticize, but you just didn't mention whether you associate a certain license with open access, and I would associate CC BY, and then of course, that text and data mining problem would be minimized. That's one thing. The other thing is there is currently a process going on in Europe to change copyright law, and there's discussion about introducing an exemption for text and data mining. I'm not happy with the way the discussion is going, but things start to move, and I think it's important that the research community raises its voice and argues that it's important that text and data mining should be free for everybody, not just the research community. The other thing I would want to comment, in the first part of your presentation, you mentioned that there's a strong connection between price and quality. Now, I would prefer if you would say there is a strong connection between price and a certain indicator, because I would probably question that the indicator is so good to indicate quality. Thanks.
Fine, thank you. Yes, no, that's fair. Let me respond briefly to the copyright issue, because that's, again, where the US and the rest of the world are pretty different. If the library community has been, well, we're actually hearing from the Copyright Office about this issue of changing the copyright law here, and we're terrified that it would get much worse if that happened, not better. Whereas we have this fair use carve-out now, and to Heather's point, one thing we in the library community need to be doing is educating people to exploit that as much as possible, to do things like fair use, because it's legal. We don't have to have a license that explicitly acknowledges it in general. So I want to get there, where it's just a default, but I think the way that will happen in the US could be quite different than what you can achieve in Europe. Yep.
So I've got two questions. One relates to how you defined quality in terms, especially that. And what quality actually means in an open access environment in terms of making the data available, transparent reporting, reproducibility, and do we have the right measures of quality at institutions? The other question is, and certainly in the EU and increasingly in the US, the discussion has moved on from open access to open science, where services around data, software, different types of research objects, in addition to articles, and you know, the big discussions around preprints. And do you see a set APC for an article as the vehicle to cover a suite of services, or do you see an APC breaking down perhaps to provide money for different types of services that might be dependent on in different disciplines, a preprint fee, for example, or submission fees, or data servicing fees, or that sort of thing?
Those are both excellent questions. And I almost regret using the word quality there, except that that's what authors identified as what they care about. That's their word. And so all we were trying to do is find an indicator that we could kind of map to that perceived quality. And because there is this correlation, you know, with things like impact factor and SNP, we used that. But I admit that it's far from perfect. Of course, that doesn't really measure quality. And there are lots of people here and elsewhere trying to come up with better ways of measuring that, right? So we did not believe that impact factor or SNP is a real measure of quality. It was just a shortcut. But I do also want to mention something about the other question you had, which is the open science. And you know, we didn't talk about whether APCs, that model, should apply to other forms of research output, because I, in particular, don't necessarily want to pour new wine in old bottles and recreate that paradigm for all these new kinds of research outputs that we've had with journals. And this has been talked about for quite a while because of the notion of data papers and software papers, which forces you back into the same old model, right? And so I do work with a lot of researchers who are producing data and software, and we're trying to figure out very different ways of sharing those and paying for that than we have with the journal market. But of course, this is not a solved problem, you know. But I hope that we don't end up in a one-size-fits-all world, because I think that would be bad. Okay, next question?
Don Samuelek from Editage. I'm just playing devil's advocate. I'm wondering whether in your discussion group and doing the data analysis and the study, whether you considered the other side of the coin, that if the librarian doesn't have the need to justify internally to the institution that they have to buy these subscriptions, would your budgets actually remain the same? And I would argue that they're not going to, in which case the modeling would not work because the library budgets would shrink. And in fact, a lot of the library budgets for APCs would likely switch over to the research office and away from the library. So I'm just wondering whether you guys had thought about what that would mean.
So you won't hear this from a lot of librarians, but I actually don't care. You know, it's the institution's money. I get my money from the provost, so does the Office of Research. You know, indirect cost covers part of the library budget now. So it's just institutional funds, right? And of course, I want to keep control over as much of them as possible because I feel like I'm a good agent for the author. So hopefully it wouldn't mean just taking away the library budget and giving it to the Office of Research or something like that. But so what I do want is for us to be in the mix of stakeholders who are working with authors and publishers on this transaction, but without necessarily worrying about whether those dollars are in the library budget or somewhere else.
Yeah, my point is that it would be, I think, politically extremely hard to justify that same budget to convince the institution that that same budget should be used for APC charges versus subscriptions, which are historically have always been justified. And
well, we need to test that, okay? Because I mean, I've had conversations with my provost and chancellor about it, and they're not averse in principle. But yeah, they need to understand, you know, why this is a better model. But to them, it's just money. So And I do have to justify my journal budget, right? I have to do that every year. It's not like they just give it to me without question. So, yeah, we have to make the case. You're absolutely right. David? David, and then, oh, and I know we have to stop. Okay, I'll stop. Okay, I'm sorry, you first.
Thank you. Robinson from Johns Hopkins.
Yep.
I was really interested in when you were talking about the price points between if grant money can be used to help with the APCs.
Right.
Because I've talked with several people, including our vice provost for research, who says, the grant can tell me I can use this for paying APCs, and I am not going to do it. So do you have anything in mind to force that to happen? Because he's going to pay his students first.
Right. Well, that was the whole point about discretionary budgets, right? Whether it is a grant that you have or an account that was set up for you, it's your money. So if that author wants to be in the journal that they want to be in, and I can only give them $1,000, where are they going to find the other two, right? So they may say, I'm not going to use my grant, but they may not really have any options if they want to publish in that journal. Otherwise, they're free to shop around for a better publisher or a cheaper publisher. So that's sort of the assertion. We want that to happen. In a way, okay, yes, I know. I'm going to have a lot of pissed off researchers too, but they're already pissed off, so, yeah. Sorry, David, and then we'll stop. Okay.
I would change my question a little bit just to address yours. APCs for, at least in the sciences and biomedicine, which they're most familiar, are a very minuscule part of a grant, and researchers pay APCs out of their grants all the time. I mean, I don't think PLOS and BMC would be anywhere near as big as they were if they weren't coming out of these grants. And at least, I believe all federal grants, or virtually most, certainly all in the public health service, it's a perfectly allowable cost. People pay roughly the same amount to go to a meeting like this to present. Nobody thinks twice about doing that. So,
right.
I think it is reasonable if we kind of change researchers' ideas a little bit. But as I said, a lot of them, at least in the sciences and biomedicine, do this all the time. I think the real problem is in the social sciences and the humanities, where the grants are much lower, and it really would hurt their budget.
Right. So, and in defense of that, one of the things I've been studying recently is the history of page charges, which is fascinating. I feel like we're just reinventing the wheel here, because back in the 1930s in this country, they decided that they couldn't rely on revenue just from subscriptions anymore because of the growth of research publishing and the number of journals that they were being asked to publish. So they decided that really it is in these so-called research patrons' best interest to help fund journals, and that meant research universities and grant agencies. And that notion was met with, shock and awe by researchers. What do you mean we would pay? But so what happened is that foundations and philanthropists stepped in and subsidized those costs for about 10 years until they became kind of normal. And ever since then, authors have been paying them without even thinking about it. So to this point about not using grant funds, they're doing it now to pay submission fees and page charges and all those other.
But then if they're not using the grant, that makes the burden heavier on the library.
Right. Well, no, because that's up to you. You could say, I'm not paying more than X. This is a fair subsidy. You can get published for this amount of money. So if you want to go fancy, find the money. And I'm just saying that you can use grants for this because they are now. So it's not a crazy idea. Yeah. Okay, I need to stop talking now. So thank you all.